Due to technical difficulties, we are joining the program already in progress.
And we put the deletes together. So internally we have a grouping mechanism. So depending upon regardless of how you define them in your code, we actually group them for a performance. Also within the execute, we start an edit session on each of the data stores that are mentioned within your methods. Each of the edits must be independent of one another. If you're doing things which are dependent, then we need to use the chaining mechanism of the edit operation. When the execute succeeds, we get an item on the operation stack, on the undo stack. If we have a failure, then if any of the edits fail, then all of the edits within your edit operation are going to roll back. And what you need to be doing is checking the error message in that particular instance to find out why you failed. When you save or cancel your edits, that edit session is actually ended and it kind of rolls everything back. So when we talk about chaining, a chaining is an operation that is dependent on a previous operation. So we actually have two operations, but what you're interested in is only having one item on the undo redo stack. So in a normal situation, you might create an edit operation, do a number of operations and then execute, create another operation, do another of methods and execute. In that instance, you'll have two items on the undo redo stack. For chaining, what you do is you create your edit operation, do your methods and do an execute. And then after that execute is successful, you create a chain of that first operation, do some methods, and then execute that chained operation. And what that does is give you one item on the undo stack. And the reason you're going to do a chained operation is if you only want one item on the undo stack, but your second set of operations require something like an object ID, or a particular shape to have already been committed to the database. So I'll have an example of this in a minute within Visual Studio. So here I am again, here's my little code snippet with a flow. We create our initiating edit operation. We specify our methods. We execute it. If it succeeds, we call the create chained operation to create our second dependent operation, do our particular method, and then execute the chain. So let's see these particular instances within Visual Studio. Here I am in ArcGIS Pro. I have an add-in tab, which has a number of buttons across the tab. And my first set of buttons here are Edit Operation Basic and Edit Operation Chain. So when I execute the basic operation, I'm going to jump into my breakpoint in Visual Studio. It's just a simple button. I'm retrieving layers from the map, a specific set of layers from the map, and then I'm jumping to the background thread because the edit operation requires the background thread. I create my edit operation object. I give it a name so that I actually have something in the undo stack. I have a cancel message. And then in this particular button, I am looping through one of the particular feature classes to get a shape. But then I am choosing to create 3 different points on 3 different layers, getting a buffer distance to buffer 2 particular polygons on different layers, and then going to head and execute the operation. And you can see that the items that are selected are the ones that I actually modified. So I created 3 new points and modified these particular polygons. Now if I go and look at the data source on this particular map, you can see that I have the pink points and polygons are in one file geodatabase, the green ones are in a different file geodatabase, and the red ones are in a third file geodatabase. So what I've actually done is an edit operation that has spanned multiple data stores. And all I have up here is one item in the undo stack.
just saying, bless you.
Oh. If I come to my chain operation and click my chain operation, again, just a button on the ribbon, I'm going to do an edit against one of the particular layers. Again, create my edit operation, give it a name. I'm going to create one feature in one of the layers. So I'm just setting up a geometry, I'm creating a map point, and then setting up the dictionary of attributes for this particular new feature. I'm going to go ahead and call create, but I actually have a breakpoint on this particular action, which is a part of the create, to retrieve the new object ID of the feature that's created. And you can see at this point I haven't actually got a value in new OID. It's really just the one that has been initialized to me, which is -1. And this part, this action part of the create, is not actually going to get executed until my edit operation is executed. So there's no way to get an OID until that feature is actually created in the geodatabase. So if I go ahead and run on the execute, you'll see that I then get the breakpoint firing to assign my new OID. And then my other breakpoint chains, well, my other breakpoint, what's the word I'm looking for? I stop at my next breakpoint after the execution is completed, and you can see that I actually do have a value in my new OID field at this point. Now that I have my new object ID, I want to actually add an attachment to that feature. And the reason I'm chaining is because my add attachment method actually requires an OID. So I'm dependent on that first create feature to have been completed before I can actually add my attachment. So I'm going to go ahead and create my chained operation, call my add attachment method, and then execute my chained method. And if I go over to my attributes pane, you can see that I have a new feature that's been created. I have all my attributes set up. I also have the attachment tab where you can see my attachment that's been added. But then if I go over to my undo stack, I still have my single operation on the undo stack for that create, so create new facility record. So I've actually done my creation and then added my attachment, and even though I've done them in two edit operations, because I chained them together, I have one item in the undo stack. So now when I go and undo, it's going to undo my add attachment, and it's also going to undo my create feature. The next part of the edit operation is the callback method. So can I actually get a show of hands for who uses the callback method now? Who knows about the callback method and who uses it? Okay, is there a particular scenario for why you're using the callback function? Gentleman down the front, you raised your hand. Why do you use the callback function? I don't know.
So,
okay.
So that's already the first case. It's like, don't use a callback.
Yeah. Sorry? Why do you use the callback function?
I have hidden fields that aren't part of the database.
You have hidden fields that aren't.
Hidden geodatabase. I mean, layers.
So you have.
Layers that are external.
Okay, so they're not in your particular project, right? Okay, so that is one scenario where you need to use the callback function. We recommend not using the callback function unless you absolutely have to. A lot of what we're trying to do is create additional methods on the edit operation so people can avoid using the callback function. There are certain specialized scenarios where you need to have custom handling, and this is what the callback is for. Generally, these situations are where you have non-geodatabase tables in your geodatabase. You're wanting to edit data that isn't actually in your project, so you need to use the geodatabase API. There's an edit for where there is no coarse-grained API method existing on the edit operation. And if you're using it for this particular reason, we'd kind of like to know what your coarse-grained method is that you're doing, because we'd like to see whether it's effective to add that particular method into the edit operation object itself. And then actually at 2.1, when we introduced annotation, using the callback was the way to edit the text symbol properties. We've changed that at 2.2. There's now a different methodology for editing annotation, so there's really no reason for using the callback for annotation, but it was a reason at 2.1. And it's really only for these particular scenarios where the callback is necessary.
Why is it a problem to use it?
It's not a problem per se. It's just that we would like to make things easier for you by giving you a method on the edit operation. The callback becomes a little bit more complicated because you need to be invalidating the context to make sure that the caches get refreshed correctly and that the map looks as it is after your edit's completed. And that's one reason why we want to try and give people easier methods on the edit operation so you don't need to worry about refreshing all of that caching all of the time.
There's nothing wrong with doing a callback, but it shouldn't be your first thought if you're thinking about editing, let's put it this way.
Right. So we kind of want it to be the fallback and this is my only resource option as opposed to this is the option that I know about. Some of the things that you need to be careful about with the callback is you need to make sure that you use non-recycling cursors when you're updating rows. By default, the search method on a table has a parameter which is saying, hey, am I recycling or non-recycling? The default value is true to say, yes, I want to be recycling. So you need to make sure that when you do a search on a table that you set that parameter to be false so that you're doing a non-recycling cursor. You're responsible for calling store or create row or whatever it is that you are doing in that callback. And you're also responsible for the feature dataset or the feature invalidation. So it just means that the callback's one of these ones where you as the developer have a lot of additional things that you need to be worrying about. So here's a code snippet for how the callback is configured. Again, create your edit operation and give it a name. Set up all the layer information that you're interested in, and then call the callback function. You need to provide it with a context, and that context is the data sets and the tables that you'll be editing. And then you can go ahead and do all your edits that you need to do. In this particular situation, I'm getting a query filter. I'm doing a search on the table. Again, like I said, you need to make sure that you're using a non-recycling cursor, so make sure you pass false into that search method. And then you iterate through your cursor, doing the things that you need to do, making sure that you invalidate that context. So if I quickly jump back into Pro and Visual Studio, again, here's my button to illustrate the callback. And I go ahead and click that again, just another button and an on-click. I'm going to go ahead and get the layer that I'm interested in out of the map. Create myself an edit operation, give it a name, set up some initial parameters. Again, I'm going to create a new feature, same as I did in the chaining operation. So I have my geometry and my set of attributes. I call the create method. And then what I'm actually going to be doing in the external table is I need to access that external geodatabase, and I am going to be updating a field in this building count table to say, hey, for this particular building with this particular name, I have this many records. But I don't happen to have that table in my map. So this is why I'm using the callback function, because I'm needing to access a table in a geodatabase that isn't in my map. So in order to do that, I need to create a reference to the geodatabase. I need to actually find that table in the geodatabase and then set up my callback function. Again, I have a breakpoint within the callback function, but you can see that I'm not going there until after I actually execute the operation. So within the callback, I'm setting up a query filter. I'm going to go ahead and do a search on the table. passing in false because I'm doing a non-recycling cursor search because I want to update a record. Move through to find the record, and in this particular instance, the first time around, I don't actually have anything called building 51 in my building count table, so I need to go ahead and create a new row, assign my attributes, so my building name with a count, create the row, and then invalidate the context. So now if I go and look in my actual geodatabase, here's my building count table that I was updating. And if I just add this into my map, you can see now that I have a record in here saying building 51 with a count of 1, meaning I have one new record in my buildings layer which has a name of building 51. Thomas.
So let's take a look at an additional characteristic that is sitting there on EditOperation. And that has to do with dataset compatibility. So Ed is exposed as a property on the operation itself and essentially has two members or two values on here. So one is long, meaning...
Still projecting.
Oops. But you were on the same slide.
Yes, but I'm not anymore.
Okay. So essentially, two values on this enumeration. One is the long, which means that the edits are being placed on the undo and redo stack. And a short, meaning that the edits are committed immediately to the underlying data store. So by default, the editor in Pro is a big harmonious kind of entity saying everything goes. So the default is it's in its state what we're calling a mixed mode. So it is accepting long and short transactions or types at the same time. Remember, one of those beautiful gotchas or benefits of using an edit operation is that you can target multiple data stores, workspaces at the same time. And you don't really need to worry about where they're coming from, what their characteristics are, and so forth. Well, sometimes you do, but by default, it is allowing all the edits to be to come into the editing environment, and then it's doing its internal sorting, as we've seen that it has an order as well. It orders then the pieces concerning short and long transactions as well. So this edit operation type is really, so by default, if you were to look at that property, it is null, meaning that it is actually of this type of a mixed mode, and it's not being enforced. So the ordering is happening, so the long transaction go actually onto the undo and redo stack. What it does internally is it's actually establishing an edit session and then maintaining the edit session on your behalf until you actually then do the commit for the long transaction pieces. For the short transaction pieces, it's just an immediate commit. And as a as a result of that, they are not participating in the undo and redo behavior. Now, what this operation type really is, we'll get to that. So by default, it is in the mixed mode, but you can also then explicitly set it to force it into a behavior. And usually the way you do that, the day before on Wednesday, we had a question on why you want to do that, or a question leading into that is kind of like you want to create a consistent experience for your user. So sometimes because we're allowing everything in, and all of a sudden you commit your edits, or you're saying, okay, this is what I would like to do, but then you're getting into trouble. It's like, oh, dang it, I can't undo that one. So if you on certain situations where you would like to have a more consistent experience to the uninitiated user, you can actually enforce certain operation types. So if we were setting it to long, we're actually disallowing any kind of short transactions or vice versa. Now, what that means, if we're enforcing something and we're encountering a situation that is violating of our expectation of the type, the whole edit operation actually fails. So it never takes place. It's just coming back with an error, and then you would need to handle it or provide an appropriate error message for that. So the edit operation type then itself is a combination of the underlying geodatabase type as well as the registration type. The geodatabase type we get from the data store. The registration type we get of the feature class. And so here's the example or the table on how it is being determined. So for example, for a file system geodatabase, which is usually the shapefile, there's no versioning happening, so that participates in an edit session and resulting in a long transaction type. For local geodatabase, a file geodatabase that I have on my disk, no versioning, it is resulting in a long. So now, the distinction now comes in for the enterprise geodatabase. If it is versioned, it is creating an edit session for me, and I can undo that one. If it's non-versioned, it is a direct commit into the database. So it is short, and I can't do that one. That's just happening as soon as I'm executing my operation. Then we can look at the services. So for a standard hosted feature service, for example, that I'm creating on my portal, that is also a short transaction. And then we're looking at the branch versioning pattern, most commonly used, or you'll probably run into it with the utility network services, is kind of like, well, if I'm operating against the default, then it is a short transaction, and I'm working against the name branched version, then I can participate in that edit, in an edit session, meaning I participate in the undo and redo operation. As a resulting step for the operation types, or that I'm looking as part of my edit operation object, is mentioning kind of like we see that then mirrored in this table. So for the cancel edit operation, mostly you get a yes all the way through. So you can interrupt the edit operation itself. The only standout here is kind of like the hosted feature services portion. You can cancel that. So 2.2 and before, you could not cancel that. In 2.3, you can cancel that behavior. But what actually is happening behind the scenes is we have a commit first, and then we're issuing a delete command right after that. So technically, it's not quite a cancel, but for you, if you would actually trace it all the way down, you do see two edit operations occurring. And then very similar to what we're seeing, or what we saw on the table before, is that essentially the essence of the long transaction types that can be redone, and as an extension, then you can discard the edits or save the edits for the type of long. And the no's you'll see then, that's the equivalent for the type of short, where it's really going directly into the geodatabase and it's happening right away. That's pretty much just a recap on the semantics of driving it home one more time. For longs, we can do the undo and then also then check on the edits themselves. So once we do the save part, very similar to what Norel already mentioned, is kind of like at that point we're committing and then flushing the edit session, closing the underlying edit session for the long transaction type, and actually then clearing the undo and redo stack once we have actually committed it into the database. So let's take a look at some examples. Let's open our debug session. So I'm bringing up a project where I do have 3 different data stores in here. And as the display is coming up, we have the points in here, our crime points. They're coming from a shapefile. The yellow polygon area, my precincts, are coming from an enterprise geodatabase. And the blue polygons are coming out of a file geodatabase that I have on my disk. And so let's take a closer look. Actually, let's find out what they are directly on what is their operation type. And for that, we have written kind of like a few extension methods. So as we're going through the layers and we're encountering our first one, let's figure out what it actually is. So we're going in here, and the first one we're going, okay, let's figure out the geodatabase type. So if we're taking a closer look at that one, that is file system. Then the registration type is non-versioned. And if you remember the table, well, that's pretty much the description that we have for a shapefile. And as a result of that, it is of transaction type long. It can participate in an edit session. Wonderful. So let's take a look at the second layer. If we're stepping into this one, that is our enterprise geodatabase. And if we're taking a look at the registration type, it comes back as non-versioned, actually meaning, suspense, it's of type short. And we don't want to really do that for the third layer. But essentially what we can then come up with is kind of like, then we can take a look on, just make a list of the layers that are participating in here. Actually, let's bring this back in front of our map. And essentially, it's just kind of like what we're expecting. It's like, well, the shapefile we can do, we can place on the undo and redo stack. The enterprise one is a direct commit, and the file geodatabase again is a long type. So what does that mean for our editing experience? So I'm performing a clip right here, and my clip geometry is actually straddling 2 different types. So as I'm finishing my sketch and going ahead for the editing, for the operation, I haven't really done much yet. And I'm just going to check right now. Oops. It's the wrong order. You didn't see that. Let's do that one more time. So as I'm stepping through there, I'm expecting the default behavior of the editor experience in the Pro. So as I'm checking for its operation type, I'm expecting to be, the first time I'm hitting it with all the default settings, to be of type null, meaning that it's in that hybrid mode, so that it is accepting short and long transaction, and the editor environment just works its magic by sorting out and doing the right things according to the type. So let's quickly go ahead and let's do our difference. Our most beautiful sketch geometry. So as we're stepping through, so as we're asking for the type out of the default behavior, it's null. So we're in mixed behavior. So that is just the way we have it, the default behavior. And as expected, it's a beautiful clip, probably the most beautiful clip you've seen all Dev Summit long. So that is actually wonderful. I mean, that's, of course, I intended that clip. That's exactly what I wanted. And it's like, well, maybe it's not the most beautiful one. So how about we'll undo, let's undo that behavior. However, now if I'm undoing that, I'm actually experience the difference between short and long, right? So for the file geodatabase that actually participated in that undo redo, this operation is, I can fix. I can roll back in time. The SDE one is like, yeah, sorry, dude, you're done. So that is the default behavior. So if I would like to kind of like guide it in a more consistent way, let's take a look at that one. I do have a magic button and I can fix it. And now let's actually go back to our edit operation change. And this time I'm actually forcing it into the long. So that means that all the edits that I would like to do have to be participating in an edit session. If anything violates that requirement of the type, an error will be thrown and the edit operation will fail. And so as we're going through that one more time, and now we're performing the second most beautiful clip of your Dev Summit. So we're stepping through. So by default, we're getting the null type back, but now we're actually forcing it onto the long. So if I were to look now in my edit operation and look at its type being set to long, and we're going ahead. So for each layer, we're performing our difference operation. And now we're executing. However, the result coming out of the edit operation, now that is a false statement. So it has failed due to the restriction of me wanting to only accept long in our edit operation. And if we do execute, then we can take a look at the error message, and it's exactly telling us that is because we're requesting type long, it can't operate against non-versioned database, which my enterprise geodatabase happens to be. So the whole thing was a no-go. And that is it for the edit operation types.
Okay, the final thing we're going to talk about is edit events, and we have two types of edit events within the editing API. One is those row events, and we have 3 different row events which are fired during the transaction. So their events are the row created event, the row changed event, or the row deleted event. And so these are raised whenever a row is being created, modified, or deleted. So you're in the middle of that transaction at that particular time. With these particular events, you need to subscribe on a per dataset basis. So if you're interested in listening to a row created event on 5 different feature classes, you need to subscribe to that event on all 5 different feature classes. You use these particular row events to make changes to the row being edited. So you can validate attributes, you can cancel a transaction, you can update that particular row. So for instance, you might be trapping the row created event and you want to add a particular attribute to that row. You would use the row created event for this particular instance. You can also log edits to a different table. If you're interested in doing that, then you need to be using the core data API. So here, when I subscribed and when I get the event, I end up with a row changed event args. This gives you access to the row that was edited. It also gives you the edit type to tell you whether it was a create, change, or delete. And then you also have a cancel edit method on that particular event args to allow you to abort the transaction if that's what you're interested in. Say if perhaps the validation didn't pass. Oops, went too far. So here's a little code snippet for what my context of my row changed event is. I've subscribed. I'm looking at the particular row to see whether the value has changed within that edit. I'm doing a validation on that particular field, and in this instance my validation has failed, so I want to go and cancel the edit. Like I mentioned, if you're interested in editing a separate table within that particular row event, then you can't use the edit operation. You can't create a new edit operation with any of these events. If you do that, the whole edit's going to fail, and it's not a happy environment to be in. So you actually need to be using the core data API, similar to what I was showing you in the callback function. You need to create a reference to the geodatabase, you need to open the data set that you're interested in, you need to either create a row buffer or update an existing row. And then you need to call the create row or the store or whatever it is that you're doing. This is going to change in 2.4. A part of 2.4, what we're actually going to give you in the row event args is the actual operation object. So there won't be quite as much need to use the geodatabase API at 2.4, but right now this is the way to go ahead and do it. And the sample I'm going to show you is going to illustrate this. So let's just jump back into ArcGIS Pro. My final button over here is just an event spy. So I'm going to go ahead and subscribe to a number of events on the layers that are in my map. And this particular doc pane, which is launched from that button, is going to let me subscribe and unsubscribe to those events. And when I do some edits, we're going to see what events I've subscribed to. And this little checkbox is going to let me cancel an event if that's what I want to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is start the event spy. And you can see I'm just coming into a command. And I'm going to go ahead and register. And like I said, this particular event, well, the row created, row changed, and row deleted events, I need to subscribe on a per dataset basis. So I'm going to pull every layer out of my map, and I'm going to iterate through each of those ones, get the feature class for each of those layers, and subscribe for each particular layer, all 3 events. And you can see that because I'm iterating through each of the layers, I'm hitting this breakpoint every time. Now once I've subscribed, I can go ahead and run a create. So again, I'm just going to create one of these particular points. And then I'm going to come into this row event handler, and this is the event handler I subscribed for each one of those events. So what I'm doing in this particular event is I'm using the args that come in. I'm looking at the particular row that's come in, which is going to be my newly created row, and I'm getting the table. I'm recording that just on my doc pane. And then I'm actually looking at possibly validating, possibly cancelling according to whatever my checkboxes were, and then adding a record into my audit trail. And this audit trail is a separate table out it just happens to be in my map, but because I'm actually in the event, I can't use the edit operation, even though the table is in my map. I need to use the geodatabase API. So I can go ahead and find the table from my map, but now I need to get the table and using the geodatabase API, create a row buffer, fill out the appropriate fields in that row buffer, and go ahead and create a new row. So you can see that I've got my event log here. If I go ahead and open up my change history table, you can see that I added a new row here today, 8th of March, 9:14. I can go ahead and modify a row. And if I go ahead and modify an attribute, again, I come into the row event handler because I subscribed to the row changed event. Again, I can record it on my SPI, go through my checkboxes according to my values, and again, add another record into the audit trail for the modify. So again, here's another record in my audit trail using the geodatabase API, and here's another item here in my SPI. If I go ahead and check the cancel edits, when I go and edit again and hit the apply, again, I'll come into my row event handler. In this instance, my checkbox for cancel edit is correct, is on, and so I can actually just cancel the entire edit. And so even though I might still be adding a record into my audit trail, I'll get the standard error message saying that the edit has been cancelled. So that's what we have for the row events. There's one other event that we have, which is actually the edit completed event. And this is the one event that fires after the transaction completes. Like I said before, the created event, the changed event, the deleted event, they occur while you're within the transaction. So you still have the ability to modify attributes or actually cancel the edit. This particular edit occurs afterwards. So you have no way of cancelling the edit. What you actually get is what was created and what was modified and what was deleted. It's actually just a single event too. The other ones you subscribed on a per dataset basis. This one is a global event. You subscribed once and you get it regardless of where that particular transaction occurred. You also get it for any time you use an edit operation. If you're using the geodatabase API, you won't be getting an edit completed event. They only occur within when people are using edit operations or when you're saving edits or cancelling edits. So here's a code snippet here. Like I said, it's a single event, so I go ahead and subscribe, and then when that event fires, I get all of the items that are created, all of the items that were modified, or all of the items that were deleted with that particular edit operation event. So in summary, like we've been mentioning all throughout the week with the editing sessions, the edit operation is the preferred editing scenario for within Pro. It gives you the ability to be on the undo redo stack, gives you the ability to do cancelling. You have the ability to have coarse grain methods to chain operations together, and to use the callback in special scenarios. We also talked today about dataset compatibility and edit operation types and what that means for UI behavior and the short and the long transaction. And then we had a quick look at the events that we have. So I think that's all we have. Do we have any questions? Lots of questions. Oh my gosh.
Let's start from the right.
Pick one.
I could really use a topology event, topology change event or something like that. Is that on the board?
Okay, so you're looking for a topology changed event. Are you looking for something that is when the topology definition changes, or when an edge changes? So when an edge is moved, you mean? Are you talking about like when the topology graph changes? I can pass it along to the people in Redlands and we can get it put on the list, I suspect. I don't see why not.
We'll record it as an enhancement request, yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you could, I'll go back to the team, but maybe also if you post something on GeoNote with a specific use case, that will help us in making sure that we develop specifically what it is that you're wanting to be able to fix your scenario.
Because of course you can just listen for change events. Change events.
You get quite a few of them, I'm sure.
All collected in one.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting scenario. Yeah. Next question.
Can you do query by param with the query filter?
Query by param with the query builder. Well, the query builder is really just a UI for, if I'm thinking about the right query builder, the query builder is just a UI for, I'm sorry? The filter class?
In the code I saw that you just concat the query string by yourself. That lead to SQL injection.
I'm not quite sure I understand your question.
Yes, you can pass in a query filter when you're searching for your...
Yeah. But the where clause you create query filter. All the examples I'm seeing here during this week has always been just concatenating the string for yourself. And if you do that, one of the params can have more data in it that cuts the where clause and execute other SQL code called SQL injection. And the way to protect against that is query by param.
Oh, okay. We don't have that right now. As far as I know, everything is just via the query filter and you just need to fill in that where clause yourself. So you're looking at specifically trying to avoid SQL injection?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
One of the biggest
Security loophole, yeah. Okay, that's something that's never come up before either, so that's something we'll make a note of and take back to the team and see what we can do for that. Yeah. And then I think we had another question here.
On all the tables you had where you're discussing long transaction, short transaction when versioning, when you say versioning, do you mean versioning and or archiving, or only versioning for geodatabase?
Versioning, I think.
Versioning,
right,
yes.
It's just either traditional versioning or the branch versioning.
Archive-enabled teacher class, which of those categories does it fall into?
I believe when it's archived, it has to be versioned, and depending, doesn't it? Right, I mean, you generally don't archive unless you're versioned as already. Is that not correct?
That's not true.
That's not true? Okay, sorry. I guess in that scenario, if you can archive without versioning, then you would be committing to the base table. That's the same as being non-versioned, right? So you would be a short transaction.
I don't know. I would have to...
We'd have to take a look at it and see what actually happens.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, same thing. If you want to post something on GeoNet, we can investigate and then go ahead and answer your particular questions, just so that it becomes a public question and answer for other people to be looking at.
Over here.
Yes?
When you discuss about edit operation types and short and long, and here you say you explicitly define them for consistency. However, in your demo, when you try to do a long transaction, you fail. So not too sure if you can force it to do long or short.
You can force them to be long or short by setting that edit operation type.
So the consistency is that you are setting, well, look at it in the first example. All the edits are happening fine, so this is kind of like the expected behavior, right? But now if you want to undo, then all of a sudden you get two behaviors. So in that case, if you only would like one behavior, edits are happening, and a consistent experience with respect to undo or the edit session underneath it, that is that enforcement of or setting the consistency expectation that only certain types are allowed in there.
But the operation failed when you try to force it,
right? Right, because I had a short and a long in there. So the edit operation occurred against my file geodatabase as well as the enterprise. The expectation coming in there second time around was I'm only allowing edits that are participating in a long transaction. The enterprise one was against a non-versioned entity. That was a short one, so direct. And everything in my edit operation, two edits in there. One was violating my constraint of long, and then the whole edit operation failed. In the back row.
So for the chain edit operations, I haven't really worked with them a ton, so this might be super obvious, but you can chain multiple together even past just one chain?
Yes, yes, you can. If that makes sense for your particular scenario, right? If you need to chain off the chain because that second edit operation is something that you're depending on for that third one, yes, you can create a chain off the chain.
Okay.
You don't create that second chain off the first one because your dependency is the second edit operation, so you would create the chain off the second one. Similar to the standard edit operation, you can do more than one thing in your chained operation. So if you wanted to add 5 attachments, you can add 5 attachments and then execute that chained operation. And then if, again, like your scenario, you've got a dependency, then you can create a third chain and then do what you need to do and execute that third chain. Obviously, you know, if you're starting to get to the point where you got 6 or 7 chains, then I would look at what your workflow actually is and whether there's something else we can be doing. Right, yeah. Any other questions? One at the back?
One of the projects I'm about to work on is moving a ELL written for ArcMap 10.6 that once we save our edits, we run the CLL as a button. And it identifies the differences between 2 different versions, summarizes that, then puts it into a staging table.
Mm-hmm.
That process of inserting it into a staging table, is that going to require a callback, or is there another way around that?
Is that staging table a geodatabase table or just a stand? Yeah.
RSE.
Right. But it's not. But it's not necessarily in your map. Then yes, that would be a scenario where you would have to use the callback, or you could just use the standard geodatabase API. But in that particular instance, you're not going to be in an edit operation, so you don't get the undo. So anything that goes in a callback is also part of the undo redo stack, even though you're using the geodatabase API. But as soon as you use the geodatabase API outside of the edit operation, you no longer have the protection of the undo and the redo stack.
The current workflow within the DLL just calls for a standard insert into that table using SQL,
Yep.
and then executing stored procedures from there. So all the rollback is handled by the stored procedures.
Right. yeah, using the geodatabase API, you're probably not going to get that whole rollback scenario. Come to pour, where we have the edit operation off that row changed event args, probably will help you a little bit more in terms of following that pattern to get the undo redo environment. We are adding additional overloads on the edit operation to deal with the fact that the tables are external. So instead of accessing map member and OIDs, which are basically reliant on the fact that the data is in your map, we have overloads which will be table and feature class type of things, which lets you go out to this external geodatabase, but get the protection of the undo and the redo. Right.
So that's kind of like one of the reasons where kind of like, well, stay with the edit operation methods that we're providing. So for most of the use cases, callbacks do not exist. As soon as you're getting into that kind of behavior, you're getting into a little bit of the intricacies of like that the edit session is maintained by the application. So you going then executing a stored procedure, you're essentially almost like sidestepping that and talking directly to the database, kind of like almost behind the back of the application. That is, you can do that, but you also need to then be aware of some of the gotchas that are coming along with it. Yeah.
Yes? No, here, yes.
Yeah, just a quick question. So if you need to use like a callback because you need to access like other tables that's not in the map or anything, like what's the advantage of that as opposed to just using the geodatabase API?
You get to, you are subscribed to the undo and the redo.
So it's the undo redo.
Right,
Yep.
yeah. Well, and the fact that, you know, you have the ability to make sure that the map is refreshed by invalidating the context. If you use just the raw geodatabase API, the refresh probably isn't going to happen for you. I don't know of anything else. It's the caching and the undo and the redo. Yeah.
So potentially if you're playing with the callback, it's kind of like when you do when things are not behaving as you are kind of like expecting them to, kind of like you have a table open but you don't see your edits come in, that's usually an indication that you didn't invalidate the cache before and after, so that all the components in the system are actually being notified that something has changed. So that's, again, it's perfectly fine to do a callback, but it's another step of consideration that you have then to take on as a developer on making sure that all the components are still in sync.
Yes, at the back there.
One question regarding branch versioning. Using RGIS Pro SDK, can you create a new branches to all the post during cancellation or not using SDK?
Can you create branches using the Pro SDK on the branch bit?
SDK, I have not seen any example.
I don't believe that's in the API, in the public API now yet. You have to use the application to do that, yeah. There may be, I was going to say there may be a GP tool, but I don't know about that. Oh, and the REST API, using the REST API. So if we just go back to the callback again, the people that put up their hand to say they were using the edit operation callback, are there any that were using it for non-external table scenarios? No? Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming out on a Friday morning. And,